This is Pro and Con with Indiana University President Miles Brand. Our topic is the life and legacy of Herman B. Wells.
Indiana University is a dynamic institution in a dynamic world. During the next century of academic history, university education in this republic will be largely in the hands of the tax-supported institution.
Builder, ambassador, benefactor, patriarch, Herman B. Wells was all these things and much more. This spring, Indiana University and the world lost one of the 20th century's greatest educators when Wells passed away at the age of 97. The centerpiece of Wells's career was the quarter century served as IU's president from 1938 to 1962. He hired the faculty, launched the programs, and articulated the vision that helped make it a world-class university.
And this is the attitude of our alma mater. Each student scholar is precious in her eye. Each stands for a unique individuality, and each represents a divine opportunity.
He attributed his success to being lucky and was always modest about his achievements.
The university doesn't owe me any thanks, as much as I appreciate your beautiful tribute. Quite the contrary. The obligation goes the other way. Because it's given me a chance to have wonderful work with wonderful people for a whole lifetime.
Personal magnetism, courage in the face of controversy, dedication to international programs in the arts, a wily sense of humor. All these are among the memories of Herman B. Wells. How will his legacy endure? What will future generations know of this man and the world he helped make? Each of us has a personal perspective what Herman Wells meant. In a few moments, I'll be talking about his life and achievements with my colleagues, Ken Gross-Lewis, Jim Capshew. But first, I spoke earlier with another legendary university president from the state of Indiana, someone who knew and served with Herman Wells, the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, President Emeritus of the University of Notre Dame. I asked Father Hesburgh how he came to know Herman.
Well, it was really when I became a young president here. You know, Herman was like a mother hen, and he didn't want you to be out there in left field without a glove. And when I became president, of course, he immediately got in touch. And anytime I had a problem, he was always there to help with it. And we did a lot of things together.
You know, that's unique in the sense of a level of cooperation between the public university sector and the private sector. Herman really worked hard at that, didn't he?
He did. He was a very large man, not just physically, but in his heart and mind. And he reached out, and he was looking at all of education in the state of Indiana, not just public education. And we have a lot of small schools in this state, but he reached out to all of them, and he protected all of them. And when things came up that required some kind of a common effort of public and private, he was always there at the head of the procession, but making room for everybody else.
And he was very much interested in the quality of education, too, wouldn't you say?
Oh, no question about it. When you think of what he did to Indiana, he took it from a little Midwestern school, not very well known, to a school of really international dimensions. And when I think of what he did in the music department, what he did in foreign languages, esoteric foreign languages, what he did to open up Indiana to the whole world. Well, for example, you can speak of Indiana in Bangkok, and they know just as much about it as they do in Bloomington.
I know I went to Warsaw. I met with the American ambassador to Poland there, and he said, did you know that Indiana University is better known in Poland than it is in the United States? I don't know if that was true or not, but it was certainly what Herman had in mind.
You bet. He took this little school and made it a great school, and I was especially impressed by his outreach when he wanted to make Indiana's effect felt everywhere, and right here in our yard, too.
It was remarkable, too, at the time he did it. America was not reaching abroad after World War II. Herman had the foresight to see that that was a necessary part of education and good for Indiana's citizens.
Yes, he had been abroad for the government in Latin America and in Europe after the war, and he saw the great necessity of us reaching out and helping them and having our people learn their languages, and he was just a remarkable fellow for his foresight.
Could you think of any incidents in which you worked directly with Herman on some key projects, either at home or abroad, that stick in your mind?
Well, one particular sticks in my mind. Back, I guess it must have been the late 50s or early 60s, we had this program out of Washington that was pretty large. You know, the student bodies had grown so much since the end of World War II that we all needed different and varied facilities. So the government came up and said, here's a lump sum for every state, and you guys figure out how much of it goes to public and how much goes to private. Now, that's like throwing a piece of raw meat out in front of a couple of hungry dogs. And you can imagine how people were scrambling in all the various states around Indiana. Here there was not the slightest ripple. Herman just called a meeting at Turkey Run with all of the presidents. He had Fred Hovde and myself and himself as kind of head. And we reached out to everybody and said, everybody's going to get his share. And Herman says, I think we ought to begin by just splitting it down the middle, 50-50. And then after we've gotten used to working together, then we can split it up according to enrollment numbers. Well, I took care of the privates, he took care of the publics. We went through millions and millions of dollars, all kinds of new educational facilities, and not a single squabble. Whereas all around us, the fighting between publics and privates over that booty was pretty awful.
That's an interesting story, and I think it does both exhibit his ability to work together with you and others, but also his fairness of mind.
Very fair.
You know, but Herman could be a tough guy, too, when he had to. For example, with the Kinsey controversy, he held his ground strongly, defending intellectual and academic freedom.
He was under great pressure there, and very few people could have stood that.
And I think we've all benefited by Herman's model approach in that regard on defending academic freedom.
Let me give you one more example.
Okay.
Not on academic freedom, but on making education available to everybody in this state. He called me one day and he said, would you be upset if I were to put a branch of Indiana University right there in South Bend? And I said, Herman, quite the opposite. We have all kinds of young people here that need what Indiana has to offer. They can't afford Notre Dame. Maybe they don't want to come to Notre Dame or St. Mary's or Bethel. But if you were here, we would have equal opportunity for all people, especially poor people. And of course, he was very sensitive to the racial divide. So he came here and we worked together. I said, you can use our library, you can use anything we've got, because we want to help you get started. And you know, today there are as many students at Indiana University, South Bend, as there are at Notre Dame.
That's a great example. That's an experiment that has worked, foresight on the part of you and Herman B. Wells to make it happen. In fact, both our campuses continue to work together very much, so we're engaged now in new efforts in medical education, which I'm sure you know.
You bet, and we love you fellows. And I got to say something else, that while this was happening in Indiana, University of Illinois Bloomington, not Bloomington, but Urbana,
yes,
they decided that they were going to move into the city of Chicago. And I hate to say it, but you couldn't believe what happened. Chicago, Northwestern, Loyola, DePaul, they are all up in arms. They said, you're coming into our market, you're stealing our students. Now today they all have plenty of students. And Indiana, or rather Illinois at Chicago is a very well-known university today.
Well, if you permit me, it was a two-way street. Herman had an approach, but it was complementary to your approach as well, Father Hesburgh. It wouldn't have
Well,
happened without your leadership.
Well, I don't play that up because Herman, I think, shone like a great star.
People, of course, in Indiana continue to treasure memories of Herman and his wit. I know you've had plenty of interactions with him outside of education, too, just talking and generally having good conversations with him. I'm sure you enjoyed his company, and taking a good meal with Herman was always a pleasure.
He loved to eat. But one other thing, Miles, that I think is probably very important about Herman, he was a modest fellow. He wasn't looking for accolades, and he wasn't looking for praise. And I happened to be there at the last graduation over which he presided as president. The trustees had gotten together privately without Herman and decided to give him an honorary degree. He was totally ignorant of that, so he introduced me, and I gave the commencement address, got the honorary degree, and that was to be the end of the ceremony. But the vice president, Franklin, beat him to the podium after I'd finished, and they kind of wrestled back and forth for the mic, and everybody wondered, what's happening? And finally, Franklin said, "Hey, Herman, calm down. Go over and sit down. It just happens that the trustees decided to honor you." And a big look of surprise on Herman's face. And when they read that citation to give him Indiana University's honorary doctorate, you'd think they handed him the kingdom of heaven.
That's a wonderful, wonderful story. As you know, when he passed recently, we named the main library on the Bloomington campus after Herman. However,
Oh, that's wonderful.
But however, we had to follow Herman's rules. You see, Herman had a rule. He was chairman of the naming committee up until he was 97, until the end.
Yeah.
And if someone was at the university, you could not name a building after him or her until 5 years passed. He wanted to make sure that that person's really generated a legacy and it wasn't an immediate emotional response. And so we said, we will reserve the name of the library for Herman B. Wells in 5 years from now, because we have to follow the spirit of Herman's rules in addition to wanting to honor him. But there's no question about his legacy.
Marvelous.
Good to see you today.
Good to be with you again.
I'm joined now by two Indiana University colleagues who knew Dr. Wells for many years. Ken Gross-Lewis is Vice President for Academic Affairs and Chancellor of the Bloomington campus. Jim Capchu is a faculty member in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. As a student, he worked for Herman Wells and is currently at work on a biography of him. Jim, I wonder if you would take a moment and just name the highlights that you see of Herman's life.
Sure. Well, Herman Wells came to IU in 1921, the year after the university celebrated its centennial. The president at that time was William Lowe Bryan, and Dr. Wells fell in love with this campus, and he pledged Sigma Nu Fraternity House. He lived in the house on Kirkwood, that's still standing. And he was a average student, garnering B's and C's in courses such as journalism and psychology. He got a degree in 1924 in the Department of Commerce. And so then he went back home to Lebanon, Indiana, worked in the National Bank of Lebanon for 2 years. And he came back to school to earn a master's degree in economics in 1927. And at that time, he was, his professors urged him to go to graduate school. And he became a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin, which was a noted center of social science research. He stayed up there for about a year, and then he came back down to Indiana to become the secretary of the Indiana Bankers Association. And in that job, he was charged with doing applied research on the sorry state of Indiana banks, suffering since 1921 from the agricultural recession. So the Depression started in Indiana earlier than the rest of the country. And so he worked at that job for several years. He visited bankers and banks all over the state, visiting 92 counties in the state. And then he got involved in the state government, and he reformed the banking laws. In 1932, he presented a plan, and then that plan got adopted by the legislature in 1933. The reform bill was sponsored by Governor Paul McNutt, who was a former dean of the IU Law School. And so Dr. Wells had a very distinguished public service record before he...
When did he return back to the university?
He came to, he was appointed on the faculty as an instructor in economics in 1930. And so he's juggling several full-time jobs during the 1930s. He took a leave of absence to do that government work for a couple years, and then he returned back in 1935 to become Dean of the School of Business Administration. Bryan recognized his passion for public service and appointed him the Dean of the School of Business. He served in that capacity for 2 years, and then Bryan resigned unexpectedly, and the trustees were looking around for a person to be an acting president, and so they decided Dr. Wells would be a fine choice. And at that point, he really didn't act as an acting president. He was very presidential. He appointed several committees to study the university and to decide on future courses. And about 9 months later, the trustees saw that they had their man in place. And
that was the start of a 25-year
That's right.
run.
And so they appointed him as president on March 22nd, 1938.
Ken, that started the career.
And the career never ended. One thing that amazed me was after he was not able to go out himself often, he would call me at the beginning of every semester and say, are there long lines of cars in the streets? And I was, oh yes, yes, Chancellor. I said, good, oh that's good. Are there long lines at the bookstore? I said, yes, Chancellor. Oh, that's very good, very good. It's a way of finding out what the enrollment was going to be like. And he always had an eye on looking ahead, some of the things that have already been commented on, but even a small example. Called me when the Rec Sports building was being planned, and he had seen designs of the exterior, but he said, if you have anything of the interior, bring it over so I can take a look at it. So I went over and showed him the pool and the basketball courts and squash courts, and he listened, and he said, he said, shouldn't there be a room for something that the students are going to be doing 20 years from now that we don't know they're going to be doing now? He said, in my day, for example, he said there weren't many joggers. And I said, people look at me and say, Herman, what do you know about jogging? But he said, then there's jogging, and then people get into rowing machines and weights, and he said, there's going to be something that we don't know now. So let's have a room in the Rec Sports building that's used, but only for temporary purposes. And at some point, when students are doing something we don't even know about, there'll be a room for it.
Well, I think thinking ahead, but also thinking about the environment in which people live and work. Herman really was very much concerned with the beauty of the campus, the interior, exterior of buildings. Jim, you know that as well, that Herman was very much concerned with the trees, with the grass, and he had a fondness for it that's really permeated the whole campus.
Yes, he practiced environmental stewardship before that became a popular word. And he was very interested in expanding the campus. During his presidency, the university acquired 1,700 acres for the future expansion of the campus. And he also was very keen on preserving old buildings, the renovation of the Old Crescent, preserving Dunn's Woods. He was always there and was a voice of reason and compassion for the natural woodland setting of the campus. And he really fostered that ideal and imbued that to the staff and the faculty and the students. And that's one of the things that we're
that
happy.
acquisition of land was not without some controversy, because when he purchased what was farmland, where we now have the stadium and assembly hall and track and field, he was criticized by some of the trustees and the local paper for buying land that was so far from the campus it would never be used. And yet, if you think about it, maybe with the exception of the University of Iowa, among the Big Ten residential campuses, Indiana and Iowa are probably the only two that are pretty much contained within the same space, with the exception of the optometry school, the Poplar's Garage. We're pretty much between, Indiana and Union and 3rd or Atwater and 17th Street at the bypass now. But others, Madison, Ann Arbor, have their lovely quadrangles, but they've intermingled with the city.
But he was also president at a time of significant growth. When he became president, I think there were 10 or 11,000 students.
No, there was 5,000 students.
5,000 students,
5,000.
even lower. And when he finished, there were close to 30.
That's right. Mhm.
And we've gained a few thousand since then, but not many. I mean, we've pretty much stabilized in size. So Herman, during his tenure, really oversaw the growth of the campus and shaped the modern campus as we know it now. It's really quite remarkable during that period of time.
And he was very interested in having residence halls, and he didn't want any student to come here and to be turned away for lack of housing. And so he established this wonderful residence hall system right after the war. The campus enrollment doubled in 1 year from 1946 to 1947. And so the start of classes in the fall of 1946 was delayed for 3 weeks because they didn't have the space to put all the students.
And that was the conclusion of World War II,
That's
and the
right,
GIs came to campus.
Right.
We would be remiss if we didn't at least acknowledge and pay attention to Herman's very significant role in academic freedom and his defense of Kinsey for the right to publish and discuss his research, no matter what the topic, independent of the content, but just in defense of freedom. Now, when Herman undertook that, he was fighting a very difficult battle.
And he was not as well supported by the faculty as the myth has developed. That is, that the impression has been given that it was Indiana University, Bloomington, that was supporting Kinsey. It was primarily Herman Wells supporting Kinsey. Right. And he had some faculty on his side, but a lot of faculty were really concerned that this was the wrong thing to do, and not so much the defense, but that Kinsey's research was questionable enough, had enough controversy in it that some faculty would not have minded if Kinsey had gone away.
And there was some intimidation, too, because the state had gone through a difficult budgetary situation right before this had occurred. In fact, the budget was cut 10% by the legislature, and the faculty were concerned that the governor, who was not happy with this at the time, was going to cut even further. But Herman stood his ground, and he gets a great deal of credit in retrospect for that.
A lot of courageous things like that he did. I know one example is that early in the 1950s, during the hearings of Senator McCarthy in Washington, when fear of communism was probably at its highest pitch in the United States, Herman held symposia on the Bloomington campus on the Soviet Union and on communism for Indiana state legislators. He invited the legislators here, used Bloomington faculty, and invited people from the State Department. And Herman once told me that in addition to wanting the legislators to understand more about the Soviet Union and about communism, he also wanted them to see that the Bloomington faculty knew more about both than the people in the State Department did.
And I'm sure he was right about that at the time. But Herman, the causes right now, from hindsight, look exactly right. They were difficult causes he took up. Defense of African Americans attending the university on equal grounds was a difficult thing to do at the time, but Herman was unstinting in his defense of that. Wouldn't you say, Jim?
Yes, and he accomplished the desegregation of the campus, fairly quietly, and he didn't really ruffle any feathers too much. One of the stories that George Taliaferro tells, he was the star player on the football team, 1945, and he was barred from living with his white teammates and things like that, and he couldn't eat in the restaurants in Bloomington. And so Dr. Wells called up the restaurants and said, well, I'm thinking about expanding student dining facilities on campus because the black students can't eat in your restaurant. And And, you know, it's a nice form of blackmail, and it worked.
He was not opposed to blackmail in a very nice way. So he told me once that the person in charge of city water and utilities came and said that unfortunately, he went through all the reasons, the university's bill was going to increase by about 30%. Wells said, oh, I certainly understand, you know, you have your problems, and don't worry about it at all. So the person left, and then Wells called Joe Franklin, the person Father Hesburgh mentioned, who was his vice president and treasurer, and said, without telling him anything about this conversation, said, Joe, I think we should look into having our own water and utilities facility, but we need some consultants, and who can we find out about some consultants? And Joe, being helpful, said, well, maybe I can call the person in charge of the local water company and get some advice from him about consultants. And, oh, it's a very good idea, said Wells.
Well, just another example of Herman's leadership. He's willing to take a stand, but to do so in a diplomatic way. Herman Wells was a great, great man, not just because of what he did for Indiana University, but because of the principles he led his life by and the principles that we will seek to emulate both here at Indiana University and elsewhere. It's been our honor, really, to be the recipients of his good works. Thank you very much.